"Take me on your horse, and I'll give you something no woman can give you." That was what she said, her voice strained and urgent, as the late afternoon light slipped lower across the frontier road. Before the story goes any further, remember to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. West of the mining settlement, the road had narrowed until it barely deserved the name. It was less a road than a habit kept alive by the few people who still believed. There was a reason to pass through. Silas Ward rode it at an even, unhurried pace, his horse steady beneath him. The saddle leather was worn smooth, shaped by years of use that had nothing to do with comfort. Behind him, the settlement faded without ceremony. It hadn't collapsed. It had simply been abandoned one business at a time, until only what was necessary remained. Silas had left early on purpose. He'd loaded his supplies quickly, paid in cash, and avoided conversation. He knew the questions that came next, where he lived now, why he always came alone, and he had no interest in answering them. At 38, he was lean from labor, not design, and carried himself with the restraint of a man who'd learned that attention brought consequences. His past wasn't something he spoke about. It lived in fragments, violence, hard decisions, outcomes he couldn't undo. His life now was built around reducing risk. He lived north of the settlement in a cabin set far enough away to keep complications at bay. This supply run wasn't strictly necessary, but it gave him an excuse to move through familiar ground without lingering. The air had begun to cool, a kind of cold that crept inward instead of biting. Silas stayed alert without tension, reading the land ahead, watching the slope, the dry wash cutting across the road at an angle that caught shadow early. The horse noticed first. Its pace slowed just enough to register. Silas tightened the reins and followed the animal's attention to the left, where the wash dipped shallow and uneven. That was where he saw her. She was low to the ground, too close to the road to suggest hiding. It looked more like she'd dropped where she stood. Her dark hair lay loose against pale dirt. Her bare feet were scraped and red, marked by someone who hadn't stopped moving for a long time. Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not panic, but calculation. A moment where empathy and caution collided and demanded a decision. He dismounted slowly, hands visible, posture open. Sudden movement could turn balance into threat. He didn't look directly at her face. Instead, he watched her stance, her breathing, the way her body held itself ready to run. When she heard his boots, she pushed upright, sharp and uneven, eyes locking onto him with focus sharpened by fear rather than aggression. She spoke quickly, not rambling, controlled. She explained just enough to make the danger behind her clear. Without naming it outright, someone was coming. The road behind her wasn't safe. She offered him something in return: his horse, distance, protection. The words sounded practiced, like she'd made the offer before and survived worse for it. Silas listened without interrupting. He noticed how her weight shifted constantly, how her gaze kept drifting past him down the road. Responsibility pressed against his instinct to keep distance. This was the tension that had shaped his life since he'd chosen isolation over engagement. He let the silence stretch longer than politeness required, deciding what kind of man he would be in that moment. He didn't respond to the offer. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, took out his canteen, and set it on the ground within her reach. Then he stepped back, turning his shoulders slightly away. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight help offered without control. As the light faded and the wind moved low through the grass, Silas considered the cost. He had built his life on predictability. She was here because predictability had failed her. He understood both realities. Riding past her would have been easier. It would also have been final. After a long pause, he gestured toward the horse and spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, unforced. She could ride with him, not as payment, not as obligation, because the road behind her was dangerous, and the one ahead led somewhere quieter. In that moment, Silas accepted that his journey home would no longer be solitary. She understood that his silence wasn't indifference. It was a boundary drawn with intention. The decision didn't bring relief, only movement. Silas helped her onto the horse with brief, careful contact, attention fixed on balance. She settled behind him stiffly, leaving space between them until the uneven ground forced her closer. He adjusted his seat so the horse could compensate and started north without looking back. They rode in silence. The road dissolved into open land, and Silas guided by memory rather than track. Darkness thickened, the cold deepened, and he felt her tension through the way she held his coat. Once her balance failed, and she leaned into him. He chose not to stop. Warmth and shelter mattered more than explanation now. The cabin appeared in pieces, the roofline, the fence post he'd repaired last spring, a cleared ground that held firm after rain. Silas slowed, dismounted, and tied the reins. He stepped aside to let her climb down on her own. When she slipped, he steadied her briefly, then released. Inside, the cabin was spare but orderly. Silas lit the lamp, set dry clothes and food near the stove, and gestured without comment. When he took his bedroll to the outer room, she hesitated. He met her eyes once and explained simply that he slept there. Then he stepped outside, leaving her alone with warmth, food, and the unfamiliar weight of safety offered without condition. As Silas lay awake, listening to the stove and the faint movement inside, he knew he'd altered the shape of his life. Whatever followed wouldn't end cleanly. Still, he remained still, committed to seeing the choice through. Morning arrived without drama, announced not by sunlight, but by the subtle easing of cold. The air inside the cabin no longer fogged with breath, and Silas was awake before the stove lost its last glow. He moved quietly, the way he always did, careful not to disturb a space that functioned best when it stayed predictable. He checked the fire, set water to heat, and stepped outside to read the sky. No wind yet, no signs of riders. The land answered plainly, the way it always had, and he let that guide the shape of the day before words had a chance to form. When he came back inside, she was awake. Ayanna sat on the edge of the chair near the table, wearing the spare clothes he'd left the night before. The sleeves were rolled once, deliberate, practical. Her posture was upright, alert, as though rest hadn't dulled her readiness. She watched him without speaking. Silas acknowledged her with a brief nod, placed a cup of warm water within reach, and returned to his routine. He didn't crowd the space or force conversation. He let the quiet do its work. She spoke first, giving her name in a steady voice. Not as a request, but a fact. Ayanna. Silas repeated it once to confirm he'd heard her, then offered his own. There was no handshake, no explanation, just an exchange of information. He noticed how closely she listened, her attention fixed on him rather than the room. This wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. She was still deciding whether this place was temporary. Silas laid out the day without framing it as instruction. Repairs needed attention. Supplies had to be sorted. She could rest or help. The choice was intentional. He watched her consider it, her gaze drifting briefly to the window, before returning to him. When she asked where she'd be useful, he directed her to a small pile of torn fabric and tools near the table, explaining how he preferred repairs done. His tone stayed even, boundaries clear but flexible. As the hours passed, the cabin filled with quiet signs of shared work. Wood scraped softly against wood. thread pulled through cloth. Silas shifted position now and then, adjusting tools. Ayanna spoke in short pieces, releasing information only as it became relevant. She explained how she'd been taken during a dispute she hadn't started, how escape had come down to timing rather than strength. Silas listened without pressing, answering only when acknowledgement was needed. He let her decide what stayed. Unspoken. He adjusted the space without announcing it, placing water where she wouldn't have to ask, moving tools only after confirming she was finished with them. She noticed. Gradually, something in her posture eased. By late afternoon, the repairs were done. Silas brought in firewood and set it down closer than usual, a quiet signal that the workday was ending. They ate together as the light shifted. The lamp cast steady illumination across the table. The presence of another person no longer felt intrusive. Silas explained how he structured his days, measuring time by tasks completed rather than dates remembered. Ayanna listened without interruption, recognizing the discipline beneath the simplicity. When the meal ended, Silas cleared the table and left the outer room door open longer than before. It wasn't an invitation, just an adjustment. That night, as the cabin settled and the land resumed its low sounds outside, both of them understood something had changed. Not because anything had been promised, but because the rhythm of the day had proven workable. The decision to continue wasn't spoken. It was made through action. The fourth morning didn't feel like arrival, but it no longer felt temporary either. Silas noticed the difference while standing at the edge of the clearing, coat open, studying the ground where frost hadn't settled. The change was subtle, the kind that only showed itself when routine shifted. For the first time since she'd crossed his threshold, his planning extended beyond what could be finished before nightfall. He marked it internally not as hope, but as adjustment. Inside, Ayanna moved with more certainty. She'd learned the shape of the space without being shown, knew which boards creaked and which held firm. Silas noticed while tightening a strap. Near the door, familiarity had replaced vigilance in small ways. It didn't unsettle him. It sharpened his attention. He explained the day's work with more detail than before. A section of fence had shifted after the last storm. A water barrel needed moving to reduce strain. These weren't favors. They were maintenance work meant to sustain something lasting. He made it clear she wasn't obligated. He also didn't soften with staying involved. They walked the perimeter together after breakfast, distance between them consistent but unforced. Silas pointed out landmarks she'd need if she planned to move freely, the slope where rain collected, the ground that softened after thaw, the brush that concealed sight lines from the road. He framed it as orientation, not instruction. Ayanna asked practical questions about function, not just safety. Silas answered with the same clarity he applied to his own choices. As they worked, he saw how easily she adapted. She lifted when lifting was needed, stepped back when space mattered, spoke only when information counted. There was no attempt to impress, no withdrawal either. Her effort was measured, controlled. Silas recognized the discipline beneath it. This wasn't someone unused to labor. This was someone who learned quickly when mistakes had consequences. Late in the afternoon, movement near the tree line caught Silas's attention. His body stiffened before thought. Ayanna noticed immediately not the land, but him. He raised a hand slightly, signaling awareness, and waited until the motion resolved into nothing more than wind through branches. The moment passed, but it left an impression. She'd read him correctly. He'd allowed it. They sat on the low stone wall to drink water, the silence between them no longer strained. Silas used the pause to explain something he rarely spoke of, not his past in detail, but why he avoided towns and gatherings. He stated it plainly. He didn't function well where expectations multiplied without purpose. He didn't justify it. Ayanna acknowledged the logic without pressing. She accepted the boundary without treating it as rejection. When they returned to the cabin, Ayana moved the water barrel without being asked, adjusting its placement so it could be reached from two sides. She explained her reasoning simply. Silas tested it once, nodded, and left it where she'd put it. The acceptance was quiet, but it carried weight. For the first time, the space had been altered by someone other than him. As evening settled in, Silas took inventory of supplies with more transparency than he was used to. He laid items out on the table: grain, dried meat, tools, speaking in practical terms about what would need replenishing before winter set in fully. He didn't assume her presence was permanent. He also didn't plan as if it were temporary. Ayana listened carefully, counting alongside him, offering observations that reflected long-term thinking rather than immediate survival. Silas registered it without comment, aware that planning together shifted the nature of what they were doing. Dinner that night was unremarkable, but the tone was different. The conversation didn't circle back to escape or pursuit. Instead, they talked about weather patterns, workload, and how to pace tasks without wearing themselves down. Silas noticed she no longer watched the door while she ate. Ayana noticed he no longer positioned himself between her and the exit by default. Neither of them said anything about it. Later, as Silas prepared the outer room, he paused and brought out a second blanket, placing it near the door without explanation. It wasn't an invitation. It was acknowledgement of shared conditions. Ayana saw the gesture and accepted it quietly, understanding the restraint behind it. That night, Silas lay awake longer than usual, not listening for danger, but replaying the day with deliberate clarity. He'd allowed another person to alter the function of his life through competence rather than urgency, and it unsettled him less than he'd expected. Inside, Ayana sat near the cooling stove for a long time. Safety without condition was unfamiliar. She was aware that whatever came next would be shaped by what she chose, not by what she owed. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Not slower, but more deliberate. Silas noticed the change while working near the far edge of the property, an area he'd always treated as a buffer rather than a boundary. He no longer measured distance only by warning time. He measured it by how quickly he could return with information, with supplies, with certainty. The land hadn't changed. His use of it had. Ayana spent one morning reorganizing the interior, not adding anything, just shifting items from places chosen for convenience to places chosen for logic. When Silas came in to retrieve tools, he paused to register the effect. The cabin was easier to move through, more intelligible. They spoke little, not because silence was required, but because explanation wasn't. Silas repaired a section of corral that hadn't failed yet, but would eventually. Preventive work, done before necessity forced it. Ayana prepared dried stores, adjusting quantities with an eye toward shared consumption rather than individual rationing. The difference was subtle, but meaningful. Planning for one person demanded discipline. Planning for two required trust. Near midday, Silas called out once, measured and calm, and Ayana joined him outside without hesitation. He told her he intended to walk the southern ridge, not because of immediate concern, but because avoidance created blind spots over time. He offered her the choice to stay behind or come along. Ayana considered briefly, then chose to go, not for protection, but participation. The walk took longer than expected, not from difficulty, but because Silas explained the terrain as they moved, where water collected after storms, where tracks lingered longer than they should, where sound carried farther at dusk. Ayana absorbed it with focused attention, asking for clarification only when function demanded it. At one point, she noticed a mark Silas had overlooked. It wasn't significant on its own, but it mattered enough to note. He adjusted his assessment without defensiveness. They rested briefly near a low rise, sitting at different elevations to maintain sightlines rather than comfort. For the first time, Silas spoke more openly about restraint, not as morality, but necessity. He explained that, acting too quickly, in the past had narrowed options rather than expanded them. He didn't call it regret. He called it understanding earned late. Ayanna didn't respond with sympathy. She said she didn't expect decisiveness without context-only honesty when a choice was made. The exchange drew a line neither crossed, and in doing so, defined something shared. When they returned to the cabin, the light had shifted toward late afternoon. Silas made a decision he hadn't planned for. He brought out 2 markers he used for seasonal planning and set them on the table, pointing to tasks that extended beyond the coming week. He explained each briefly, not assigning responsibility, just confirming interest. Ayanna listened, then selected one herself, stating plainly that she intended to take it on. The acceptance was mutual and unforced. They prepared the evening meal, together without dividing roles. Each handled tasks based on proximity rather than habit. At one point, Silas reached across the table to move an item closer to her without thinking. The gesture was small, almost unremarkable, but it caught both of their attention. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. She didn't move. The moment passed without comment, leaving behind a sense of familiarity that hadn't been there before. Later, as they stepped outside to secure the area, Silas adjusted his pace to match hers. The choice was unconscious, but noticeable. Ayanna shortened her stride slightly in response, maintaining alignment rather than testing it. They walked the perimeter together, the distance between them narrowing naturally. Near the edge of the clearing, Silas paused and rested his hand briefly against hers. There was no grip, no signal, just acknowledgement. Ayanna accepted it without hesitation, posture unchanged, attention forward. When he released her hand, neither spoke. The meaning didn't need explanation. That night, the cabin held a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of caution, but the quiet of agreement. Silas remained awake long enough to realize his vigilance had shifted direction. He was no longer watching for what might be taken away. He was aware of what he intended to protect because it had been chosen in the inner room. Ayanna lay still, not listening for threat, but considering continuity. She was no longer measuring days by survival alone. She was measuring them by contribution, by proximity, by the steady presence of someone who didn't confuse control with care. Neither of them named what had formed. They didn't need to. The structure was holding, and staying was no longer temporary. The first disruption didn't announce itself with noise or urgency. That was why Silas noticed it before Ayanna did. He was working along the western fence line just after midday, replacing a warped rail that had split cleanly along the grain. Everything looked the same. The sky was steady. The wind moved the way it should have. What changed was what failed to happen. No birds lifted from the brush. No small movement followed his steps. The quiet remained, but it no longer felt neutral. Silas stopped without straightening fully, one hand resting on the fence post, his weight balanced so he could move in any direction without haste. Years of experience had taught him to recognize this kind of stillness, the kind that arrived not because nothing was there, but because something already had been. His pulse stayed even. His focus narrowed. He didn't call out. Inside the cabin, Ayanna was sorting supplies he'd laid out earlier, making quiet notes on what could be stretched and what couldn't. Her attention was deep enough that she missed the first shift. When she did look up, it wasn't because of sound, but pressure and awareness that didn't belong to routine. She moved to the doorway slowly, stopping short of stepping outside. Silas turned his head just enough to meet her eyes and gave a single, minimal gesture. Not alarm, awareness. It was confirmation, not warning. Ayanna stayed where she was, understanding that being unseen mattered more than proximity. The exchange was brief, silent, and complete. The riders appeared less than 10 minutes later. They came in from the south, 3 of them, following the suggestion of a track rather than a defined road. Their approach wasn't aggressive. That registered immediately. Their pace was casual, posture loose, the confidence of men who believed they had time and leverage. Silas stepped away from the fence and moved toward the cabin at an even pace, placing himself between the riders and the structure without drawing attention to the fact. When they spoke, their tone was conversational. Curious, not confrontational. Had he seen anyone pass through? Noticed tracks? Anything unusual lately? Their questions were framed lightly, testing boundaries without crossing them. Silas answered in the same measured tone, responses immediate but sparse. He didn't offer more than was asked. He didn't hedge either. Ayanna watched from the doorway, unseen. She didn't recognize the men, but she recognized the cadence, the practiced ease of those accustomed to control. Her breathing stayed, steady, though her muscles tightened. Memory pressed forward, but she forced herself to remain still. Movement now would undo what Silas was holding in place through posture alone. The conversation stretched longer than was comfortable. The riders circled without advancing, eyes scanning the land. When one of them asked directly about strangers, Silas responded without pause. His certainty did more work than any threat could have. Eventually, their interest thinned. Dissatisfaction lingered, but caution outweighed it. They exchanged glances, reassessed, and chose withdrawal over insistence. Silas didn't watch them leave. He waited until the sound of hooves dissolved completely, then remained still for several seconds more, letting the land return to its rhythm. Only then did he breathe deeper, tension easing without display. He turned toward the cabin and nodded once. Ayanna emerged after that, composed, movements controlled. They didn't speak right away. Silas closed the distance just enough to confirm. She was unharmed, then stepped past her to check the latch with more care than usual. Inside, he sat at the table without removing his coat, posture signaling the day wasn't finished. Ayanna broke the silence with an observation rather than a question, acknowledging what the encounter meant without framing it as debt. Silas clarified one point. What he'd done wasn't exceptional. It was necessary. He didn't minimize the risk. He didn't dramatize it either. The restraint in his explanation reassured her more than reassurance ever could. They spent the remainder of the afternoon adjusting the cabin's readiness without naming the reason. Silas reorganized tools closer to hand. Ayanna redistributed supplies to reduce noise and unnecessary movement. The coordination required no instruction. Each anticipated the other through observation alone. As evening approached, the tension didn't return. Something else took its place. Certainty. Dinner passed quietly. The air between them felt altered, not heavier, but more defined. Ayanna understood then that Silas's earlier restraint hadn't been hesitation or detachment. It was commitment, expressed through control. Silas understood that she'd stayed because she chose to, not because she lacked alternatives. Neither of them said it aloud. That night, Silas remained awake longer than usual, not from fear of return, but from recognition. He had drawn a line that couldn't be erased, and the decision hadn't felt forced. In the inner room, Ayanna lay still, aware that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't hiding behind him anymore. She was staying beside him. For the first time since the road, the idea didn't carry urgency. It carried weight. The morning after the riders passed felt almost too ordinary. That was what unsettled Silas as he stood near the stove, listening to the quiet settle back into its usual pattern. The land had a way of remembering disturbance, even when people pretended otherwise. He waited for the delayed echo, a shift in pressure, some small demand for response. Nothing came. The air held steady. The fire caught cleanly. The day presented itself without urgency. YNNA woke later than she had the previous mornings. Not from exhaustion, but from a body that had finally stopped bracing for interruption. She moved through the cabin without hesitation, gathering water, straightening the table, folding the second blanket Silas had placed near the door. She didn't comment on it. She put it where it belonged, treating the gesture as part of the structure rather than an exception. Silas noticed and accepted it without remark. They ate quietly. The meal was plain, but the space between them carried a different weight. The encounter with the riders had clarified boundaries that hadn't yet been named, and Silas understood that pretending nothing had changed would introduce risk of another kind. When he finished, he wiped his hands and spoke with intention rather than urgency. If attention returned to the area, adjustments would be needed. His tone stayed practical. His words were specific. He didn't suggest she leave. Ayanna listened, carefully, absorbing the information without reacting to implication. When he finished, she asked about alternatives, routes that avoided the main road, places where visibility could be reduced without losing access to water. Her questions pushed the conversation out of survival and into strategy. They spent the morning reorganizing the outer structures, not fortifying them in any dramatic sense, but streamlining movement. Silas moved tools that had been stored out of habit rather than efficiency, explaining his reasoning as he worked. Ayanna adjusted, her approach and response, offering suggestions shaped by her experience with concealment and timing. Each change was tested once and either kept or discarded based on function alone. Near the fence, Silas paused and spoke about a pattern he'd followed for years, varying routines, not out of fear, but to avoid predictability. He admitted, without embellishment, that he'd lost people by assuming stability where there was none. The admission was brief, but it carried weight. Ayanna didn't answer immediately. When she did, she said adaptation wasn't paranoia. It was survival. The exchange altered the tone of their work without slowing it. By midday, the cabin reflected their shared adjustments. Movement flowed more naturally. Tasks overlapped without interference. Silas felt the unfamiliar sensation of shared responsibility, without loss of control, and it forced him to reconsider assumptions he hadn't examined in years. He'd believed independence required isolation. The evidence in front of him suggested something more nuanced. Later, while repairing a section of the roof that had begun to sag, Silas allowed Ayanna to take the lead. He held position while she directed placement, watching how she handled authority. Without pressure, her instructions were precise. She adjusted when conditions changed instead of insisting on outcome. When the work was finished, Silas climbed down, handed her water, and continued on without comment. Acknowledgement came through action rather than praise. The afternoon brought conversation not driven by necessity, but proximity, resting near the edge of the clearing. Silas explained his isolation more clearly than before. Not retreat, but recalibration. Years of making decisions that affected others without consent had left him unwilling to lead without restraint. He said it plainly. Ayanna responded with her own boundary. Staying didn't mean surrendering agency. The exchange was direct, respectful, and necessary. It established parity without confrontation. When they returned to the cabin, Ayanna prepared a meal using combinations Silas hadn't planned, adapting what they had into something more sustaining. She explained her choices as she worked, not seeking approval, but ensuring transparency. Silas observed and adjusted his role, taking on tasks that supported rather than overshadowed her effort. Care was expressed through contribution, not service. As dusk approached, the light shifted across the floor, marking the end of the day without ceremony. They ate together, conversation drifting toward the coming season, not abstractly, but in specifics that implied duration, storage capacity, labor, the possibility of travel when conditions allowed. Silas framed these as considerations, not plans. Ayanna engaged with them as choices rather than obligations. That evening, Silas retrieved a second share he'd kept stored away and placed it opposite his own at the table. The act was deliberate. Ayanna noticed immediately and took the seat. Without hesitation, the balance of the space shifted again, not toward comfort, but intention. As night settled, Silas prepared the outer room as usual, then paused. He left the door partially open. It wasn't an invitation. It was an adjustment. Ayanna responded by extinguishing the lamp herself, signaling readiness rather than expectation. They didn't speak again that night. There was no need. The day had clarified what words hadn't. What they were building wasn't protection offered or accepted. It was a structure shaped jointly held together by consent, competence, and choice. The days that followed didn't slow. They narrowed. Attention replaced speed, and Silas noticed the difference while working near the far edge of the property, the stretch he'd always treated as buffer rather than boundary. He no longer measured distance only in terms of warning time. He measured it by how quickly he could return with information, with supplies, with certainty. The land hadn't changed. His relationship to it had. Ayanna spent the morning inside, not resting, but organizing with care that suggested permanence without claiming it. She shifted storage from places chosen for convenience to places chosen for logic, grouping items by use rather than habit. When Silas stepped in briefly to retrieve tools, he paused to register the effect. The cabin felt easier to move through, not more comfortable, but more intelligible. Nothing had been added. Nothing had been claimed. It simply made more sense. They spoke little through the first half of the day, not because silence was required, but because their work no longer needed explanation. Silas repaired a section of the corral that hadn't failed yet, but eventually would. Ayanna prepared dried stores for the coming weeks, adjusting quantities with an eye toward shared consumption. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Planning for one person demanded discipline. Planning for two required trust. Near midday, Silas called out once, measured and calm. Ayanna joined him outside without hesitation. He explained that he intended to walk the southern ridge, not because of immediate concern, but because avoidance created blind spots over time. He offered her the option to remain behind or come along, making the choice explicit rather than assumed. Ayanna considered briefly, then chose to accompany him not as protection, but participation. The walk took longer than expected, not due to difficulty, but because Silas explained the terrain as they moved, where water collected unexpectedly, where tracks lingered longer than they should, where sound carried farther at dusk. Ayanna absorbed the information with focused attention, asking questions only when function demanded it. At one point, she pointed out a mark Silas had overlooked. It wasn't significant on its own, but it was worth noting. He acknowledged it without defensiveness. Adjusting his assessment, they rested near a low rise, sitting at different elevations, to maintain sightlines rather than comfort. Within easy speaking distance, Silas allowed himself to explain something he'd avoided naming. He spoke about restraint not as a moral stance, but as a learned necessity. Acting too quickly in the past had narrowed options rather than expanded them. He didn't frame it as regret. He framed it as understanding earned late. Ayanna responded with clarity rather than sympathy. She said she didn't expect decisiveness, without context-only honesty, once a choice was made. The exchange drew a line neither crossed, and in doing so defined a shared expectation that had been missing before. They stood without ceremony, and completed the route in quiet alignment. When they returned to the cabin, the light had shifted toward late afternoon. Silas brought out 2 markers he used for seasonal planning and placed them on the table, indicating tasks that extended beyond the coming week. He explained each briefly, not assigning responsibility, only confirming interest. Ayanna listened, then selected one herself, stating plainly that she intended to take it on. The acceptance was mutual and unforced. They prepared the evening meal together without dividing roles. Each handled tasks based on proximity rather than habit. At one point, Silas reached across the table to move an object closer to her without thinking. The gesture was small, almost forgettable, but it caught both of their attention. He didn't withdraw his hand immediately. She didn't move away. The moment passed without comment, leaving behind a sense of familiarity that hadn't existed before. Later, as they stepped outside to secure the area before nightfall, Silas adjusted his pace to match hers. The choice was unconscious, but noticeable. Ayanna shortened her stride slightly in response, maintaining alignment rather than testing it. They walked the perimeter together, the distance between them narrowing naturally without intention. Near the edge of the clearing, Silas paused and rested his hand briefly against hers. There was no grip, no signal, just acknowledgement. Ayanna accepted it without hesitation, posture unchanged, attention forward. When he released her hand, neither of them spoke. The meaning was clear without articulation. That night, the cabin settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of vigilance, but the quiet of agreement. Silas remained awake long enough to recognize that his vigilance had shifted direction. He was no longer watching for what might take something away. He was aware of what he intended to protect, because it had been chosen dot in the inner room. Ayanna lay still, not listening for threat, but considering continuity. She was no longer measuring days by survival alone. She was measuring them by contribution, by proximity, by the steady presence of someone who did not confuse control with care. Neither of them named what had formed. They didn't need to. The structure was holding, and staying was no longer temporary. The change arrived quietly, without a single moment demanding recognition. Silas became aware of it at first light, standing near the shed with his hands resting on a length of rope he'd already inspected twice without realizing it. The morning was clear and sharp, the kind that usually narrowed his focus to sequence and task. This time, his thoughts moved beyond that. He was considering outcomes that involved another person by default, and the realization unsettled him less than it should have. It felt earned. Ayanna was already awake, though she moved without hurry. Her pace carried confidence rather than caution. She'd taken responsibility for the interior without ever claiming authority over it, and Silas noticed how naturally she occupied the space now. She reached for tools and supplies as if the cabin recognized her presence. There was no tension in her shoulders, no readiness to retreat. Whatever calculations had once governed, her choices had been replaced by intention. They began the day without discussion, each turning toward work that no longer required explanation. Silas focused on preparing the far storage area for winter, reorganizing it to accommodate greater volume. The task forced him to acknowledge what had changed. He wasn't preparing for endurance alone anymore. He was preparing for continuity, and that distinction carried responsibility. Ayanna joined him partway through, not to assist by default, but because the work required coordination. She suggested adjustments that improved access and reduced wasted movement. Silas implemented them immediately, trusting her judgment without review. Later, while sorting preserved food, Ayana raised a concern about balance rather than scarcity. Survival, she said, required more than enough calories. It required consistency, predictability, and margin. Silas listened carefully. He'd always measured readiness by resilience under pressure. She was measuring it by sustainability. In the afternoon, Silas retrieved materials he'd set aside for years, the boards and fasteners for reinforcing the cabin's rear wall. He hadn't avoided the task because it was difficult. He'd avoided it because altering that section meant admitting permanence. He didn't announce his reasoning. He simply began. Ayana noticed immediately and joined him without comment, understanding the significance without needing it explained. They worked in steady coordination, Silas handling structure, Ayana managing placement and alignment. The rhythm was uninterrupted by doubt. During a pause, Silas spoke quietly. He said he'd once believed keeping things temporary reduced loss, that departure felt easier when nothing was rooted. He didn't ask for agreement or absolution. He stated it as fact. Iyna responded with clarity, not comfort. Choosing to remain, she said, didn't equal captivity. Staying was only meaningful if leaving remained possible. The exchange was precise and necessary. It established that what they were building wasn't a trap, but a shared decision subject to revision only by mutual consent. When the work was finished, Silas stepped back and assessed the wall. It was solid, but what satisfied him more was the process that had produced it. Trust had shifted from conditional to functional. It no longer required constant evaluation. It simply worked. That evening, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched across the clearing, Silas brought out items he hadn't planned to share yet. Small personal effects, kept not for value, but for weight. He set them on the table without ceremony and explained where each came from, not lingering on loss, but on consequence. Ayana listened with attention, acknowledging each detail as part of the present rather than a burden of the past. In return, she spoke of her own history with equal clarity. She explained that she'd learned to read people quickly because hesitation had once cost her safety. The offer she'd made on the road, she said, hadn't been desperation alone. It had been strategy shaped by experience. Silas accepted this, without judgment, recognizing the intelligence behind it. Understanding didn't require adjustment. It allowed things to remain as they were. As night approached, Silas prepared the outer room as usual, then paused. Without comment, he moved his bedroll closer to the inner door. He didn't cross the boundary. He acknowledged proximity. Ayana noticed and responded by leaving the door fully open. The shared space was defined not by separation, but by choice. Later, as they stepped outside to secure the area one last time, Silas reached for her hand again. This time there was no hesitation. His grip was steady, deliberate. Ayana responded immediately. They stood together in silence, facing the land that had once represented escape and now represented responsibility. There was no uncertainty in the moment. That night, Silas slept deeply for the first time in years, not from exhaustion, but resolution. In the inner room, Ayana lay still, aware that the future no longer needed to be negotiated through fear or exchange. It was being built through alignment, through work shared willingly, through presence that demanded no proof. By the time the cabin settled fully into darkness, both of them understood that the question of leaving had already been answered, not with words, but with structure, trust, and the deliberate act of staying. The morning that ended the uncertainty didn't arrive with ceremony. Silas noticed it while fastening his coat, not because the temperature had changed, but because he no longer felt the need to calculate how long he might be gone. The sky was clear in a way that promised steadiness rather than challenge. The day wasn't something to manage or endure. It was something to live inside. Ayana was already outside near the edge of the clearing. Sleeves rolled, studying the ground where new growth pressed through the soil. She wasn't watching for tracks. She wasn't listening for distant movement. Her attention rested on what the land was becoming rather than what it might conceal. Silas watched her for a moment before joining her, aware that this was the first time he'd approached another person on his own land without scanning beyond them first. They spoke easily as they worked that morning, not to fill silence, but because conversation had purpose. Decisions surfaced without hesitation: where to expand storage before winter, how to adjust planting for 2 people instead of 1, whether the trail near the creek could be improved without increasing visibility from the road. Each topic assumed continuation, and neither of them challenged the assumption. Late in the morning, Silas retrieved a small box he'd kept sealed for years. Not hidden, just deliberately set aside. He placed it on the table and explained what it was before opening it. Inside lay a simple band, unadorned, chosen long ago for durability rather than display. He didn't kneel. He didn't frame the moment as a request. He told Ayanna plainly that he intended to remain fully and without reservation, and that he would never ask her to give up agency or identity in order to do so. Ayanna listened without interruption, her breathing steady. When he finished, she took a moment not out of doubt, but to weigh what was being offered. She answered clearly. She hadn't come to him seeking ownership or rescue, and she wouldn't stay where her presence was conditional. She accepted what he offered because it aligned with the life she'd already chosen, one built on consent, shared responsibility, and respect that didn't need reinforcement. They marked the decision simply. No witnesses, no declarations beyond what was necessary. What mattered wasn't how it looked, but how it would hold. The rest of the day unfolded without interruption. The rhythm unchanged, yet deeply altered. They worked together not as individuals, sharing space, but as partners shaping it. Tasks divided without discussion, each anticipating the other's needs through attention rather than habit. The land responded as it always had, indifferent, reliable. For the first time, Silas didn't keep it at arm's length. In the afternoon, they prepared a meal that reflected abundance rather than scarcity, not extravagant, just sufficient in a way that acknowledged progress. They ate outside, seated, close enough that movement was shared rather than adjusted around. Conversation drifted briefly toward the road, not with apprehension, but closure. Ayanna spoke of the life she'd left behind without bitterness. Silas spoke of the years he'd spent surviving instead of building. Neither lingered there. The past had been accounted for. It no longer required defense. As evening approached, they walked the perimeter together one final time. Not as precaution, but affirmation. The boundaries felt clear, not because they'd been reinforced, but because they were now inhabited. When they returned to the cabin, Silas secured the door out of habit, then paused, aware the act no longer carried the same meaning. Safety wasn't something he maintained alone anymore. Inside, the cabin felt complete. Not perfect, but balanced. 2 chairs at the table, 2 bedrolls aligned with intention, tools arranged for shared use. The space no longer reflected isolation, adapted for company. It reflected a life constructed jointly from the ground up. That night, there was no vigilance, no anticipation of loss. Silas slept with the assurance of someone who had stopped waiting for it. Ayanna rested knowing she no longer needed to trade herself for safety or place. What she'd offered on the road had been born of fear. What she gave now was chosen freely, returned in kind. By morning, the future wasn't abstract. It was present, defined, steady. They would remain. They would build. Whatever came, they would face it without bargaining for the right to exist beside one another. The road west of the mining settlement still led nowhere of consequence. And neither of them had any reason to follow it again.